At 0742 on the morning of March 6, 1944, Colonel Donald Blakesley sat in the cockpit of a P-51B Mustang at Debden Airfield in England, preparing to lead a mission that the Luftwaffe thought was impossible. The mission was Berlin, 560 miles into the heart of Nazi Germany. The German High Command had been told repeatedly by their intelligence officers that no American single-engine fighter had the range to reach Berlin and return. The round trip was 1,100 miles. Every fighter the Americans had tried, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, ran out of fuel hundreds of miles before reaching the capital. German pilots knew this. They waited beyond fighter range, then tore into the unescorted bombers. American bomber losses over Germany had become unsustainable. In October 1943, 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses were shot down in a single mission to Schweinfurt, 20% of the attacking force. The daylight bombing campaign was failing, but on this morning, Blakesley's P-51 had something the Germans didn't believe existed. Under each wing hung a 108-gallon drop tank, paper tanks manufactured in Britain, filled with fuel that would give his Mustang a combat radius of 850 miles. Combined with the internal 85-gallon fuselage tank and wing tanks, the P-51 carried enough fuel to fly to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and come home. The Luftwaffe High Command had declared this impossible. Their calculations said American fighters lacked the range. Their intelligence reports confirmed it. Their pilots had been briefed that they would never see enemy fighters over Berlin. They were wrong. Blakesley was 26 years old. He had been fighting Germans since 1941, first with the Royal Air Force's Eagle Squadron, then with the United States Army Air Force's 4th Fighter Group. He had flown over 500 combat missions, more than any American pilot in the war. He knew the cost of unescorted bomber raids. He had watched too many B-17s go down in flames because fighters had to turn back due to fuel limitations. Now, for the first time, he was about to take single-engine fighters all the way to the Nazi capital. What happened in the next 7 hours would change the strategic balance of the air war over Europe. The first bomber crew, the 4th Fighter Group, lost to lack of fighter escort, was Lieutenant Robert Harriman's B-17 crew on August 17, 1943. Harriman had been in England for 2 months. His crew had flown 6 missions over occupied Europe. Their target that day was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The P-47s escorted them to the German border, then turned back. They didn't have enough fuel to go farther. The Luftwaffe waited. They knew exactly when the American fighters would leave. They had been tracking escort range for months. German fighter controllers watched the P-47s turn west, then ordered their pilots to attack. Over 300 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s swarmed the bomber formations. Harriman's B-17 took cannon fire in the No. 3 engine 20 minutes after the escorts left. The engine caught fire. The pilot feathered the propeller but couldn't extinguish the flames. 2 more German fighters came in from 6 o'clock, walked cannon shells through the fuselage. The tail section broke away. The bomber fell out of formation, spinning toward Earth. 3 crew members got out. 7 didn't. The mission lost 36 bombers. 260 men killed or captured, all beyond fighter escort range. The second crew was Captain James O'Connor's B-24, lost September 6 near Stuttgart. O'Connor was a flight leader, experienced, with 14 missions completed. His formation attacked the Taube Day, Bosch Magneto plant. The P-38s escorted them as far as their fuel allowed, roughly 400 miles from England. Then they turned back. The Luftwaffe hit the formation 30 seconds later. O'Connor's crew reported on the radio that they were under attack from 15 to 20 fighters. They called for help. No fighters were available. They were alone, 150 miles inside Germany, 40 bombers against 300 German interceptors. O'Connor's aircraft took multiple 20mm cannon hits. The right-wing fuel tank exploded. The bomber rolled, inverted, and dove straight down from 22,000 feet. No parachutes were seen. 10 men dead. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost 194 heavy bombers in 3 months. Most were shot down after fighter escorts had to return to base due to fuel limitations. The crews called it going naked, flying without fighter cover. German pilots called it happy hunting in time. They knew exactly where American escort range ended. They positioned their fighters just beyond that point and waited. When the American escorts turned back, the Germans attacked in overwhelming numbers. The bombers tried to defend themselves with their 50 caliber machine guns, but a B-17's defensive fire couldn't stop a determined Luftwaffe pilot making a head-on attack at 400 miles per hour. The bomber crews were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The situation was unsustainable. The worst loss was the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943. 320 heavy bombers attacked the ball-bearing factories. 60 were shot down. 600 men killed or captured in a single day. Another 17 bombers were damaged beyond repair. Another 100 were damaged and required extensive repairs. The total loss rate was 29%. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, ordered a pause in deep penetration missions. The losses were too high. The bomber crews were exhausted. The replacement pilots were arriving with inadequate training and being killed on their first or second missions. Something had to change. Without long-range fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign couldn't continue. Without the daylight bombing campaign, the planned invasion of Europe might fail. The Germans would have time to reinforce their defences, to build more weapons, to train more pilots. The war could drag on for years. More American soldiers would die on the beaches of France if the Luftwaffe wasn't destroyed first. The problem wasn't that the bombers couldn't reach their targets. B-17s and B-24s had the range to strike anywhere in Germany. The problem was they couldn't survive the German fighters without escort. And no American fighter had the range to escort them all the way to the target and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of roughly 230 miles with internal fuel, extended to about 375 miles with drop tanks. That was enough to escort bombers to targets in western Germany, but not to Berlin, not to the Ruhr industrial region, not to the critical oil refineries and aircraft factories deep inside the Reich. The P-38 Lightning had better range, roughly 450 miles combat radius, but the aircraft suffered serious problems in the cold temperatures at high altitude over Europe. The turbocharger systems failed regularly. The pilots called it getting P-38'd, when both engines quit simultaneously at 30,000 feet. The Lightning was also in short supply. There were never enough P-38s to provide adequate escort coverage. The Spitfire, flown by the Royal Air Force, had excellent performance but insufficient range, even with drop tanks. It could barely reach Paris. The bomber crews were paying the price. They flew missions knowing that for large portions of the flight, they would be unescorted, vulnerable. They watched German fighters position themselves at the limit of American escort range, waiting. The bomber crews could see them up there, circling like sharks, counting down the minutes until the American fighters had to leave. Then the attacks would begin, wave after wave, German fighters diving through the formations, firing 20mm cannons and 30mm guns, ripping apart the unarmored bombers, killing the crews. A bomber could absorb incredible punishment and still fly, but enough hits would bring anything down. The German pilots knew where to aim: the cockpit, the engines, the wing fuel tanks. They had been killing bombers for 2 years. They were very good at it. On December 20th, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England with a new aircraft, the P-51B Mustang. The Mustang's development had been rushed and unconventional. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, asking them to build P-40 Warhawks under license. North American's president, James Kindleberger, made a counteroffer. His company could design and build a completely new fighter in the same time frame. The British agreed, skeptical but desperate for aircraft. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, led a team that designed the complete aircraft in 117 days. The prototype flew in October 1940. It was designated NA-73 by the company, Mustang by the British. The early Mustangs used Allison engines and were relegated to low-altitude tactical reconnaissance. They had superb handling characteristics and exceptional range, but the Allison engine's performance fell off dramatically above 15,000 feet. They couldn't compete with German fighters at the altitudes where bombers operated, 20,000 to 30,000 feet where the air was thin and turbochargers were essential. The Royal Air Force used them for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance, roles where low-altitude performance mattered more than high-altitude capability. Then, someone had an idea. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was excellent, the aerodynamics were superb, but the engine was wrong. Harker wrote a report suggesting that if the Allison engine was replaced with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the aircraft would have outstanding high-altitude performance. The Merlin 61 engine had a two-stage supercharger that maintained power output up to 30,000 feet and beyond. Combined with the Mustang's clean aerodynamic design and large fuel capacity, a Merlin-powered Mustang might be the long-range, high-altitude fighter everyone needed. The British took the suggestion seriously. They shipped 5 Mustang airframes to Rolls-Royce for conversion. The 5 results exceeded expectations. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang's top speed increased from 365 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Climb rate improved dramatically. Service ceiling increased from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. The aircraft transformed from a capable low-altitude fighter into an exceptional high-altitude interceptor. North American began production of Merlin-powered Mustangs in 1943, designated P-51B and P-51C models. The engine was built under license by Packard in America, designated V1657. The airframe remained essentially unchanged from the original design. The fuel capacity was extraordinary for a single-engine fighter. Internal fuel capacity was 84 gallons in the wing tanks initially, increased to 184 gallons when an 85-gallon fuselage tank was added behind the pilot during production. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks, total fuel capacity reached 400 gallons. The P-51B could fly at 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It could climb to 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes. It could turn with a BF-109, dive with a FRO-190, and most importantly, it could carry enough fuel to fly for over 6 hours. With internal fuel only, the P-51B had a combat radius of roughly 475 miles. But with 2 108-gallon drop tanks, the radius extended to 850 miles. That was enough. That was finally enough to reach Berlin, but there was a problem with the extra fuel. The P-51B's fuselage tank was located behind the pilot, aft of the center of gravity. When fully loaded with 85 gallons, the aircraft became dangerously unstable in pitch. Test pilots reported that with a full fuselage tank, violent pullouts or hard turns caused the control stick loads to reverse, meaning the pilot had to push forward on the stick to prevent the nose from pitching up further. The aircraft wanted to tumble. With a full fuselage tank, a P-51B couldn't dogfight. It could barely maneuver. The solution was to burn the fuselage tank fuel first, before entering combat. Pilots were instructed to use the fuselage tank during climb-out and cruise, keeping the aircraft stable by the time they reached enemy territory. Once the fuselage tank was empty or nearly empty, the center of gravity shifted forward and the aircraft handled normally, but that meant careful fuel management. Pilots had to monitor fuel consumption constantly, switching tanks at the right moments, calculating range to target, time to fight, fuel required for the return trip. One mistake, and they would run out of fuel over Germany. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first escort mission with the P-51 on December 5, 1943. They escorted bombers to Amiens, France, then to Emden on December 11th, then to Kiel on December 13th. The Kiel mission reached 480 miles into Germany, the deepest penetration by American single-engine fighters up to that date. The Luftwaffe responded. They sent up over 200 fighters to intercept. The 354th shot down 8 German aircraft and lost none of their own. The P-51 worked. It could fly deep into Germany, fight, and come home. Major General James Doolittle, who had just taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, saw the potential immediately. He needed that aircraft. He needed hundreds of them. The strategic bombing campaign's success depended on destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force. The only way to do that was to force them into combat where American fighters could kill them. And the only way to force them into combat was to attack targets the Germans had to defend, targets deep inside Germany, targets like Berlin. But to attack Berlin, he needed long-range fighters. He needed P-51s. Doolittle began converting fighter groups from P-47s to P-51s as quickly as aircraft became available. The 4th Fighter Group was next. Colonel Donald Blakesley, who had been assigned to the 354th in December to help them transition to combat operations, returned to the 4th in January as the new group commander. He wanted his group equipped with Mustangs. He pushed hard. Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, was reluctant. Converting a fighter group to a new aircraft type required taking the entire group off operations for weeks, while pilots and ground crews learned the new systems. Kepner couldn't afford to lose a complete fighter group during the build-up to the planned invasion of France. Blakesley made him an offer. "Give me the P-51s, and I'll have the 4th Fighter Group operational within 24 hours. Kepner thought it was impossible. Blakesley's pilots had been flying P-47s for over a year. They had no time in the P-51. The ground crews had no experience maintaining the Merlin engine. 24 hours wasn't enough time to convert an entire fighter group, Blakesley insisted. His pilots had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to the 8th. They knew the Merlin engine. They understood the British systems. His mechanics had worked on Merlins for years. They could handle it. Kepner agreed, but with a condition. If the 4th Fighter Group wasn't fully operational within 24 hours, Blakesley would be relieved of command. The 4th received their first P-51Bs on February 26, 1944. Blakesley gathered his pilots and gave them their instructions. Learn to fly them on the way to the target. They would begin combat operations within 48 hours. Some pilots had less than 30 minutes of flight time in the P-51 before flying, their first mission. The mechanics worked through the night, familiarizing themselves with the new aircraft, checking systems, loading ammunition, installing drop tanks. By February 28, the 4th Fighter Group flew their first P-51 mission, escorting bombers to France. Every aircraft returned safely. Blakesley had kept his promise. By early March 1944, the 8th Air Force had enough P-51s to attempt what had been impossible 6 months earlier, a daylight bombing raid on Berlin with fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The operation was approved. The mission was scheduled for March 3rd. The weather scrubbed it. They tried again on March 4th. The weather was marginal but acceptable. Over 600 bombers took off, escorted by over 650 fighters, including the 4th Fighter Group's P-51s. It was the first large-scale American attack on Berlin. Blakesley led his 48 Mustangs into the mission, briefing at 0500 hours. The map showed the route. Northeast across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, across northern Germany, straight to Berlin. The bombers would strike industrial targets in the city. The fighters would provide continuous escort from takeoff to landing. No bomber would fly unescorted. The weather forecast was for scattered clouds over the target, visibility 3 to 5 miles. German fighter opposition was expected to be heavy. The Luftwaffe would defend Berlin with everything they had. Intelligence estimated 300 to 400 German fighters would be airborne. The American fighters would be outnumbered in the target area, but they would have the advantage of altitude and position. The bombers would bomb from 24,000 to 26,000 feet. The fighters would fly top cover at 30,000 feet, positioned between the bombers and the sun, forcing any attacking German fighters to climb through the escort screen. Fuel management was critical. Pilots were instructed to burn their fuselage tanks to below 40 gallons before crossing into German territory. Drop tanks would be jettisoned when empty or when combat was imminent. Each pilot was responsible for monitoring his own fuel state and calculating his own return fuel requirements. No one would be left behind, but any pilot who ran out of fuel over Germany was on his own. The nearest friendly territory was the Netherlands, over 200 miles from Berlin. A P-51 could glide maybe 30 miles with no engine power. The math was clear. If you ran out of fuel over Berlin, you were not going home. The 4th Fighter Group took off at 0742. 48 Mustangs, each loaded with two 108-gallon drop tanks, full ammunition, and enough fuel to reach Berlin and fight. The aircraft were heavy. Taking off at maximum gross weight required careful technique. Too much throttle, and the torque would pull the aircraft off the runway. Too little, and the aircraft wouldn't accelerate fast enough to become airborne before running out of runway. Blakesley's Mustang lifted off after using 3/4 of the runway. He climbed to 1,000 feet, circled once, and watched his 3 squadrons form up behind him. 48 aircraft in tight formation. Silver Mustangs against the grey English morning. They set course for the North Sea. The flight to Germany took 2.5 hours. The bombers were already ahead, strung out in a formation 70 miles long, over 600 heavy bombers, carrying thousands of tons of explosives toward the Nazi capital. The 4th Fighter Group rendezvoused with their assigned bomber group over the Netherlands at 0915, exactly on schedule. Blakesley positioned his fighters in a combat spread formation 5,000 feet above the bombers, weaving back and forth to maintain position. The bombers flew straight and level, maintaining formation discipline. Below, the Dutch countryside passed by, fields and rivers and small towns. Ahead, Germany waited. They crossed the border at 0935. The first contrails appeared, high-altitude German fighters positioning for attack. Blakesley counted at least 40, maybe 50. More appeared every minute, climbing from airfields scattered across northern Germany. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything they had. Blakesley called out the contacts on the radio. Bogies, 11 o'clock high, 20 plus. Bogies, 1 o'clock level, 20 plus. Bandits forming up ahead, estimate 50 plus. His pilots acknowledged. Everyone saw them. The Germans were massing for a coordinated attack. At 0958, the first German fighters dove toward the bombers. Blakesley called out, "Here they come, break left and engage." The 4th Fighter Group turned into the attack. What followed was 7 minutes of violent aerial combat. Bf-109s and FW-190s tried to break through the escort screen. The P-51s